The call came in just past midnight, a calm yet urgent voice reporting a car ablaze off Interstate 10. Detective Carter was already at his desk, reviewing files from another case, when the dispatch crackled through his radio. A burning vehicle in the middle of nowhere wasn't unusual, but there was something about the caller's tone, subdued, almost unnerved, that prompted Carter to grab his coat and head out. By the time he arrived, the flames had subsided, leaving behind a charred skeleton of what used to be a car. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and metal. Firefighters were hosing down the remnants, their grim faces illuminated by the rotating red and blue lights of patrol cars. Carter stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder of the highway. "What do we have?" he asked the nearest uniformed officer. The man grimaced, pointing toward the smoldering wreck. "Human remains in the driver's seat. It's bad, detective. Real bad." Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. He approached the vehicle cautiously, the heat from the still warm metal radiating against his face. Through the haze, he could make out what was left of the body. A forensic tech was already taking pictures, his camera flash cutting through the darkness. The remains were barely recognizable, burnt flesh and bone fused with the seat. A grotesque image etched into Carter's memory. "Time of discovery?" Carter asked. Call came in at 12:15. Responders arrived about 10 minutes later. "Fire was too intense to save anything," the officer replied. As Carter surveyed the scene, another tech approached, holding a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a piece of fabric, blood-stained and partially burnt. "Found this near the car. Looks like it could have been torn from clothing," the tech said. Carter took the bag, his brow furrowing. "Keep looking. There's more here. We just haven't found it yet." The autopsy would later reveal the true horror. Mercedes Vega, just 22 years old, had been alive when the fire started. Smoke inhalation and severe burns contributed to her death, but the report detailed more. A gunshot wound to her arm, blunt force trauma to her head, and a chilling discovery: bleach in her throat, poured both internally and over her face. Back at the station, Carter sat at his desk, the victim's name newly added to the whiteboard behind him: Mercedes Vega. He didn't need the preliminary report to tell him this was personal. The violence, the fire, it was rage, vengeance, or a twisted message. Carter opened her file, his eyes scanning the details of her life. A young woman, an exotic dancer, last seen on surveillance footage leaving her apartment complex hours before her death. The footage played on Carter's screen. Mercedes appeared calm, carrying her bag as she walked to her car in the dimly lit parking garage. Then, just as she reached the driver's side, she stepped out of frame. The next image, taken minutes later, showed a dark stain on the concrete floor. A pool of blood. She was attacked here, Carter muttered to himself. But who took her, and why? The victim's car was later found abandoned a few miles from the scene, blood on the seats confirming she had been transported in it. Detectives worked through the night, scouring the surrounding area for more evidence. A tire track led to a second vehicle, the one Mercedes had been found in. But the search for suspects turned up nothing immediately. The next morning, Carter met with the coroner. The autopsy report confirmed his suspicions. Mercedes had suffered extensively before her death. The bleach wasn't just an afterthought, it was deliberate, a method to torture and humiliate. "This wasn't random," Carter said aloud as he closed the file. "Someone wanted her to suffer." As he drove back to the station, Carter replayed the details in his mind. The victim was young, ambitious, with no known enemies, at least none on record. Yet, the brutality of the crime suggested otherwise. The pieces didn't fit, but Carter knew from experience that they eventually would. He just needed to find the missing links. Inside his office, a team briefing was underway. "Surveillance footage from nearby businesses is being reviewed," one officer reported. "We're also checking Mercedes' phone records and social media for any leads." "Good," Carter said, his voice steady. "Someone out there knows what happened to her. We find them, and we'll have our answers." For now, all Carter had were fragments of a nightmare. A young woman, her life violently cut short, and a killer or killers, who thought they could get away with it. But Carter had seen cases like this before. The perpetrators always left something behind. It was just a matter of finding it, and he would. Detective Carter stood in the dimly lit precinct briefing room, surrounded by officers and analysts. On the board behind him was a timeline of Mercedes Vega's final hours, pieced together from the limited evidence they'd managed to collect. Photos from the crime scene and a still frame of her walking to her car stared back at him, stark reminders of the brutality she'd endured. "Here's what we know so far," Carter began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Mercedes was last seen leaving her apartment complex around 9:15 p.m. Blood was found near her car, which was later abandoned on M Avenue about 10 minutes from her residence. The vehicle she was ultimately found in was set on fire near Tonopah. That's an hour's drive west, but she wasn't discovered until after midnight. An officer raised his hand. "The timeline doesn't add up. If they took her at 9:15 and she wasn't found until 1 a.m., what were they doing for nearly 4 hours?" "That's the question," Carter replied. "And it's clear she wasn't alone. Surveillance from her apartment complex shows 2 individuals driving away in her car. They were later seen on camera abandoning it and getting into the vehicle she was found in." The room fell silent as the weight of the case settled over them. Carter gestured toward the board, where the names of 2 suspects had been hastily scrawled. The first was Sincere Hayes, a 22-year-old with a record stretching across multiple states. "Hayes was picked up in Tennessee 3 days ago," Carter continued. "He's already been charged with first-degree murder and is being extradited back to Arizona. His criminal history includes DUI, reckless driving, firearm possession, and theft. We also know he was arrested in Alabama in 2021 for possession of stolen property and marijuana, though that case was dismissed." "What's his connection to Mercedes?" another detective asked. "We're still piecing that together," Carter admitted. "But we do know this. Hayes lived just 12 miles from Joe Cujo Young, the man Mercedes identified in a 2020 armed robbery case. Young is currently out on bond awaiting trial, but the coincidence is hard to ignore." The room buzzed with murmurs. Young had been a predator, targeting women leaving a local gentlemen's club where Mercedes worked. He'd followed her home, held her at gunpoint, and forced her to hand over her belongings. Despite the terror he inflicted, Mercedes had been instrumental in identifying him and ensuring his arrest. "Could Young have orchestrated this?" someone asked. "It's possible," Carter replied. "But so far we've found no direct link between him and Hayes. That said, Young's known associates are being investigated, and we're not ruling out revenge as a motive," Hayes added. Carter smiled. The meeting ended with assignments: reviewing phone records, tracking down associates, and scouring surveillance footage for additional leads. Carter retreated to his office, where a new stack of reports awaited him. Among them was the preliminary analysis of Mercedes' phone. The last text sent from her device was to a friend, confirming plans to meet at a local arcade that night. The message was sent minutes before she disappeared. Carter's phone buzzed. It was one of the officers stationed at Hayes' arrest site in Tennessee. "We found something," the officer said. "A burner phone in Hayes' possession. Texts on it suggest he wasn't acting alone." Carter's pulse quickened. "What do the texts say?" "Most of them are vague, but one stands out. It was sent the night of the murder. She's in the car. You know what to do." Carter jotted down the details. If Hayes had accomplices, they were still out there, and they likely held the answers to Mercedes' final hours. As the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape, another officer burst into Carter's office. "We've got footage from a gas station near M Avenue," she said, handing him a USB drive. "2 men matching Hayes' description, and a third unidentified individual stopped there just after 10 p.m. They were driving Mercedes' car." Carter loaded the footage onto his computer. The video showed 3 figures exiting the vehicle. 2 entered the store while the third remained by the car, looking nervously around. Carter froze the frame and zoomed in on the third man's face. Though blurry, the image was enough to recognize him as a known associate of Hayes, already flagged in their database. "We've got our second suspect," Carter muttered. The investigation gained momentum. Search warrants were issued, and interviews with Hayes' and Young's known associates revealed additional details. One witness reported overhearing Hayes boast about taking care of business the night Mercedes died. Another claimed to have seen him driving a car that matched the description of the one set on fire. By the end of the week, a second arrest was made. The man identified in the gas station footage, a 24-year-old with prior convictions for assault and robbery, was taken into custody. Under questioning, he admitted to being involved but claimed Hayes was the mastermind. He said it was personal, the man told detectives. Something about revenge. Carter leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Revenge for what? Nothing. The man shrugged, his face pale. I don't know. He just said she had it coming. The chilling words lingered in Carter's mind as he returned to his desk. Despite the progress, there were still more questions than answers. Who else was involved? What had Mercedes done, or been perceived to do, that warranted such horrific violence? As the clock ticked past midnight, Carter stared at the evidence board, the faces of the suspects staring back at him. He knew they were closing in, but the truth remained elusive, and until he uncovered it, justice for Mercedes would remain just out of reach. Detective Carter sat at his desk, the faint hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights a constant backdrop to his thoughts. The more he dug into Mercedes Vega's life, the clearer it became that this wasn't a random act of violence. The sheer brutality of the crime, combined with the deliberate methods used, suggested a personal motive. But what could a 22-year-old woman have done to warrant such a targeted attack? Mercedes' name was already familiar to law enforcement, though not for any wrongdoing on her part. In 2020, she had been the victim of an armed robbery orchestrated by Joe Cujo Young. The case file on that incident lay open on Carter's desk, the details as disturbing now as they had been then. Already police had been on the case, but they hadn't catch it on the radar of this woman. Young, a known predator, had targeted women leaving the gentlemen's club where Mercedes worked. He would follow them home, wait until they were isolated, and then strike. In Mercedes' case, he had cornered her in the parking lot of her apartment complex late one night. The report described how he had held her at gunpoint, forcing her to hand over her phone, keys, and purse. When she hesitated, he threatened to kill her. Mercedes had been shaken but defiant. She ran to a neighbor's apartment to call 911 as soon as Young fled. Her courage didn't end there. She worked closely with investigators, picking Young out of a photo lineup and even preparing a victim impact statement for court. Her testimony had been instrumental in his arrest, but his trial had been delayed multiple times. Now, as Carter read through the notes, he couldn't ignore the eerie connections between Young and Mercedes' murder. Could he have been involved? Carter muttered to himself. Young wasn't behind bars, his trial had yet to begin, and he had plenty of time to orchestrate something like this. But linking him to Hayes wasn't straightforward. They lived just 12 miles apart in Tennessee, and Young had a reputation for surrounding himself with unsavory characters. Yet so far, no concrete evidence connected the two. Carter turned his attention to Mercedes' life after the robbery. Her family had described how the incident had changed her. Once confident and outgoing, Mercedes had become more cautious, her bright demeanor dimmed by lingering fear. She had moved to a new apartment, changed her routines, and rarely went out alone. Despite this, she remained determined to testify against Young, refusing to let him intimidate her into silence. Her parents' voices echoed in Carter's mind as he recalled their interviews. She was brave, her mother had said, but she was scared. He'd threatened her that night, told her she'd pay if she went to the cops, and now, this happens? It can't be a coincidence. Carter agreed. Revenge seemed a plausible motive, especially given the brutality of the crime. The bleach, the gunshot, the fire. It felt like a message, one designed to instill terror even in death. But if Young had orchestrated this, why wasn't he more directly implicated? And what role did Hayes play in all of this? The burner phone found with Hayes offered some insight. One text, sent shortly after Mercedes' abduction, read, "Make sure it's done right." Another, received a few hours before the murder, asked, "Does she know why?" The chilling implication was that the killers wanted Mercedes to understand why she was being targeted. But why? Carter's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. It was Officer Green, holding a folder. "We got more on Young," she said, placing it on his desk. "Turns out he's been on law enforcement's radar for years. Robbery, assault, even a few cases of suspected witness intimidation. He's slippery though, always manages to avoid a solid conviction." Carter flipped through the file. Young's pattern of violence painted a picture of a man who thrived on control and fear. Mercedes' decision to testify against him would have been a direct threat to that image. Mercedes' former senior law firm partner, Billy Boyson, had been the lawyer celebrated for his high handling of the fetal cases. "What about his alibi?" Carter asked. Green shook her head. "He was wearing an ankle monitor at the time of the murder. Doesn't mean he couldn't have coordinated it, but he wasn't physically there." It wasn't the answer Carter had hoped for, but it didn't rule Young out entirely. If he couldn't act directly, it made sense he'd enlist someone like Hayes. Someone expendable, with a history of violence and nothing to lose. Carter's phone buzzed. It was a notification from the forensics team. DNA analysis from the scene had come back, and while much of the evidence was too degraded to be useful, one sample stood out. It matched a known associate of Hayes, a man with ties to both Tennessee and Arizona. The connection was tenuous, but it was enough to suggest that Mercedes' murder was a coordinated effort. The threads were beginning to connect, but the full picture remained elusive. Was this about revenge for the robbery? Or was there something else Mercedes had become entangled in? Her family had mentioned that she'd been planning to open a gym, that she'd recently been saving money and meeting new people. Could she have crossed paths with someone dangerous without realizing it? As Carter stared at the evidence board, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay not just in the present, but in Mercedes' past. The robbery, her resolve to seek justice, her interactions with law enforcement, they were all pieces of the same puzzle. And somewhere in those pieces was the motive that would explain why a young woman's life had been extinguished so violently. Carter leaned back, exhaustion creeping in but determination pushing it aside. He had a victim who deserved justice, a family who needed answers, and a case that demanded closure. The motive was there, buried beneath layers of deception and violence. Carter was determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. Detective Carter sat across from Erica and Tom Vega in their modest living room, the walls adorned with photos of Mercedes. Her radiant smile seemed to light up every frame, a stark contrast to the anguish her parents now carried. Erica's voice trembled as she spoke, but her determination was unwavering. "Letters, if she chooses not to tell it." "It's been over a year, Detective," she began, "and we're still fighting for answers. From the beginning, we've been kept in the dark, left to piece things together ourselves." Tom nodded, his expression wary but resolute. "We didn't even learn about her death from the police. We found out through the media. Do you know how devastating that is? To have to read about your daughter's murder in a headline." Carter understood their frustration. The initial investigation had been sluggish, and communication with the family had been minimal. Erica recounted how she had to scour social media and news reports to uncover even basic details. "We had to demand updates, organize rallies, and push for them to care. It felt like they didn't think Mercedes mattered." Their advocacy efforts had gained traction, with marches and vigils drawing community support. Erica recalled standing before a crowd, holding a photo of her daughter. "She wasn't just a victim," she had said. "She was a light in our lives, and we won't let her story fade." Despite their pain, the Vegas had taken on the role of investigators, reconstructing timelines and uncovering inconsistencies. They learned about Sincere Hayes' arrest, not from authorities, but from the news. They called him a main player, but what does that even mean? Erica asked, her frustration evident. How many others were involved? What's the evidence? Tom leaned forward. This wasn't a random act. Her car was abandoned, and another vehicle picked her up. Someone planned this, and it wasn't just one person. "Nobody tries this but me," Tom cried in agitated tone. Carter admired their resolve. Erica's last words about her daughter hung in the air. "The last time I saw her, she was smiling, excited about the future. Now, all we want is justice for her." As Carter left their home, he felt a renewed sense of duty. The Vegas weren't just grieving, they were fighting. Their insights and determination would be invaluable in unraveling the truth. Carter promised himself he wouldn't rest until they had the answers they deserved. Detective Carter stood in the shadow of a flickering candlelight vigil, the soft glow illuminating a gathering of friends, family, and supporters. They held photos of Mercedes Vega, their voices mingling in a solemn chant. Justice for Mercedes. It was a scene Carter had witnessed many times in his career, but the weight of this one lingered differently. Mercedes' family stood at the center, their grief tempered by a fierce determination to ensure her story would not be forgotten. Erica Vega stepped forward, holding a framed photo of her daughter. Her voice was steady but full of emotion. Mercedes was more than what happened to her. She was smart, driven, and full of life. This isn't just about justice for her. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The vigils became an annual tradition, a way for the family to celebrate Mercedes' life while keeping the case in the public eye. They spoke of her dreams of opening a gym, her love for Christmas, and her boundless energy. Each tribute was a reminder of what had been taken and a call to action for a community that had rallied around them. Beyond the vigils, Mercedes' story spurred conversations about systemic flaws in the justice system. Advocacy groups used her case to highlight the need for better protections for victims, particularly women targeted by predators like Joe Cujo Young. Community leaders organized safety workshops, while law enforcement agencies faced increased scrutiny over their handling of similar cases. Carter found himself drawn into these efforts, speaking at public forums about the importance of persistence in seeking justice. "This case taught me that justice isn't just about solving a crime," he told one audience. "It's about ensuring the victim's voice is heard and their legacy preserved." The investigation continued to uncover new connections, with Hayes and his accomplices facing mounting charges. But for Erica and Tom, closure remained elusive. "It's not just about arrests or convictions," Tom had told Carter. "It's about understanding why this happened. We need to know the full truth." The case had changed Carter too. Mercedes' vibrant life, her untimely death, and her family's resilience served as a stark reminder of why he chose this line of work. He carried her story with him, using it to inspire younger detectives and push for reforms within his department. On the anniversary of Mercedes' death, Carter visited the memorial her family had erected at the site where her life was taken. A wreath of fresh flowers rested beside a plaque bearing her name. For a moment, the quiet desert night seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't know you," Carter murmured, his voice low. "But I won't forget you. None of us will." As he turned to leave, the flicker of candlelight in the distance reminded him that the fight for justice wasn't just about catching killers. It was about honoring the lives they tried to erase and ensuring their stories would never fade. Mercedes' story wasn't over. It was now part of something larger, a call to action that would continue to resonate for years to come.